What's interesting about Herman Melville is that he was not afraid to experiment with different forms and different genres, and most of his experimentation comes with his short stories. So, the short story that I've asked you all to read for this week is The Paradise of Bachelors and the Tartarus of Old Maids, which is, you won't find it anthologized in the Norton anthology or any of those types of things because it's one of his lesser known works, but it's really kind of interesting what he does in this story because it's he uses in this story, it's an example of a form of stellar storytelling known as a paired story, in which two separate and distinct works are connected thematically in some manner. And this form of short story reaches this kind of popularity in the 19th century magazines that were famous for publishing short fiction. And this story appeared in 1855 in Harper's New Monthly magazine, but ironically, he published it anonymously because it was so experimental. It's part autobiographical sketch and part exercise in symbolic fiction. And because of this experimentation, Melville and the editor of Harper's magazine feared that the readership might possibly take offense to some of the things that Melville was suggesting. So, in this poor, in this paired story, it's important to focus on setting, and I think that that's true for any number of Melville's works. So, pay attention to the setting. We have two sketches, if you will. These two stories take place in two very different places. We have the Paradise of Bachelors, which takes place in London, particularly at the Temple Inn, which is this very posh, rich, indulgent kind of area where there is no lack of luxury. And the second sketch, or the second part two, is the Tartarus of Old Maids, which takes place in New England. So what we see in this story is Melville in his various different travels, because he goes to London in 1849 and visits the places that he's writing about, or that his narrator explores in 1859 or 1849. And likewise, he goes back to New England and visits this paper factory, and that kind of inspires the Tartarus. To kind of set up a little bit further this paired setting, a paradise is obviously linked to heaven, and a Tartarus is a mythological hell. It is the lowest part of the underworld. And what's interesting is that I don't want you guys to mistake a Tartarus as this concept of Christian hell. A Tartarus is a very specific place of torment designed for a very specific reason in Greek mythology. It's a kind of a torture dungeon that's in this the lowest part of the low, kind of like Dante, if you want to think about it that way, um, that is set aside solely for tormenting the wicked, if you want to call them that. But it's a prison where the Titans were made to suffer, and this is a particular. I mean, this is not accidental. This juxtaposition to paradise. So we have these two very different places. both allegorically and geograph- geographically speaking. So to comment on that, it's important that you look at this parallelism, if you will, because our story, I'll be honest, this is going to be a very difficult story for some of you to read, because it's not necessarily a traditional plot storyline like something like The Cask of Amontillado. What we have here is a narrator who goes from one place to the other, and who visits one place to the next, and with his description of the two settings, that's where the kind of story comes in. We see this juxtaposition or this parallelism between the privileged bachelors, the land of the privileged bachelors, with that of the lives of the exploited maids. We see this warmth of excess of the Temple Inn compared to or paralleled with the cold sterility of the paper mill. We see the kind of decaying past, or this honor and homage to the past, living in the past that is the bachelors, versus the present slash future of machinery and industrialism with the Tartarus of the maids. So I am interested to talk with you guys in person and have a conversation about these two places. And I think that that's going to be kind of the basis of our discussion board for this week, is to look at those kind of comparisons or juxtaposition. So that's all I have for you all in terms of things for setting you guys up for reading these stories. Please come with questions that you want to discuss to our discussion, optional discussion meeting this week. And I look forward to see what you guys think of both Poe and Melville, because while they are writing at the same time, they are two completely different authors with two completely different kind of styles. And I'm going to try to weave them together in our discussion this week, although it may not seem at a cursory glance to fit as seamlessly as Hawthorne and Irving did together in the stories that I chose for that. So let me know if you have any questions, and I will be in touch with you guys soon. On a side note, before I say goodbye, I do want to mention this as you read. It's important to look at, I think, the differences between men and women and socioeconomic kind of classes in this story, and look at what Melville is saying about the significance of, or the weakness of, these two different kind of power structures that we see here. It's important, I think, to look for images of birth, images of life or lack thereof. So that's my last kind of final comment in the story this week, for the story for Melville this week.